So we talked a little bit about the repression of unions early on, and we're going to go kind of back up just a hair bit and talk about the conspiracy doctrine, which was originally where shortly after the founding fathers penned our Bill of Rights, the courts turned around and declared it illegal in 1806 in the cordwainers case to have a union. So basically, about 30 years after we were conceived as a nation, they determined that a strike for higher wages constituted a criminal conspiracy. So when workers band together and said we're no longer going to take this crap, the court said that an individual employee acting on his own may refuse to work, but an agreement between two or more workers to refuse to work constituted an unlawful criminal conspiracy. So we can draw some important implications for the present time, but at the time of the case, there were some very interesting changes to the workplace and the product market. The footwear industry was the first to feel the Industrial Revolution. Shoes and boots were often made by master workers in small shops who sold the goods to the general public in their communities. However, it soon became possible for workers to produce goods in Philadelphia and sell in other states where there was not any real production of products. So as this occurred, the wage rates for the workers began to drop because the less skilled workers were employed to do sub-assembly operations of boot manufacturing. So, capital, just like they do today, capital figured out, let's see how we can get these low-skilled operations prior to the master boot maker and source them out to the cheapest labor that we can possibly find. So when the more skilled laborers attempted to object, they were met with resistance from the owners and the new less skilled workers, because once again, as always, capital loves a pit workers against workers. The highly skilled workers elected to produce only finer shoes and left the production of the lesser quality shoes up to the owners and the less skilled workers. This allowed the owners of the new production facilities to further reduce rates. The workers responded by allowing for reduced pay for shoes to be exported at a higher rate for the local market. And then soon the workers became dependent on the export trade, and there was no turning back. So when all the workers got together to try to do something about the pay rates, some of them decided to strike. The strike vote was close. And they say 64 strike, 50 against. During this time, there was this is kind of something we talked about earlier, there was a great political debate between Thomas Jefferson and those that followed him, called the Jeffersonians, and then the Federalists, John Adams and his followers. And the Jeffersonians felt that the workers should share in the democratic process by allowing all of them to join together and give them the maximum of their individual freedoms. And the Federalists were indifferent to the welfare of the workers. They felt that the workers were incompetent to do the wise thing and thus incapable of doing the right thing for their own good, which kind of speaks to a lot of what we deal with today. And then they felt that only the rich and powerful had the right to make those decisions. And of course, the Federalists served the interests of the aristocrats. So as a week strike, the week strike is in week, not week long, but as in week, as in is a very weak
not strong.
Yep. 8 of the leaders were arrested and jailed, and then of course this frightened the rest of the strikers and kind of dissipated after that. The leaders were taken to trial before judges of that time who were predominantly Federalists, of course. they ruled that the strikers were involved in trying to take the property rights of the employers by raising their wages. Thus, that was considered criminal activity. And since the workers were a member of an association of workers, they also considered that a conspiracy. I know you got something to say, so come on with it.
Yeah. Well, that's I think the fact that it's a weak strike, it was a weak strike, a not strong strike, is really important. Jane McAlevey is a prominent labor organizer and lecturer, teacher on union issues, and she's always harping about the necessity of acquiring a supermajority for a strike. Yes. Otherwise, it's not going to be, it's not going to be powerful. It's not going to work as well. And I can't help but wonder, this looks like kind of one of the first strikes. And I can't help but wonder if those 60 had done the work of convincing and organizing and inoculating those other 50, and they had all went on strike together. I can't help but wonder, how the course of history might change.
Yep.
Because if all of the workers had gone on strike, then the capitalists would have been more motivated to increase their wages and wouldn't have had time to take them to court and all that, because they would have needed to have been taking in profits. And if other workers had seen the success of that all-out strike, they might, it's a shame, the missed opportunity there by such a weak strike. Yep. There at kind of the beginning of labor history.
And it really speaks to unions as a whole today. Business does this very well for the most part. Most businesses do this very well. When things fail, or when things, when they have a project that don't come to fruition, or they have a project that goes great, after the fact, they love to meet and talk about what do we do right and what do we do wrong. And this is where I really, as a young unionist, it got all over me, and I hated it, because every time something happened, I wanted to go on strike. And then the more that I've learned about labor history, and I think this speaks to why you need to do labor history. But as I grew in the labor movement and began negotiating contracts and began learning also about the labor history, one of the things that we do as machinists is we take a vote negotiation, and we say how many people are willing to go on strike. And generally speaking, it's around 98, 99%. Because before the contract is negotiated, everybody's willing to go on strike if they don't get what they want.
Right.
Once they see the contract nowadays, businesses have very good statisticians and analysts, and they can cater to different subsections, whether it be the younger vote, whether it be the older vote, whether it be, a skilled, a skilled portion of the bargaining unit against fork truck drivers. And they calculate those numbers, and they can generally offer enough to buy an acceptance. But, bringing it back to the point was, one thing that the machinists always do is we have two votes, and it never fails. After every contract I negotiate, probably 90% of the membership, number one, don't understand why we have two votes, but number two are just absolutely furious that we have two votes, because we have the first vote is, do we accept or do we reject the contract? And all you have to do is have a 50% plus one member accept the contract, and then we don't have the second vote, if we go back to work. If 50% plus one member votes to reject the contract, then we go to a second vote, and that vote is what the strike vote. And in order to go on strike, we have to have 66% plus one member. And so I guess that's something that a lot of the labor unions have learned over the time is you don't want just a simple majority to walk out, because a simple majority means the very, very limited minority is going to kill you going back into work.
Right.
But
Exactly.
yeah, so, and that for years that just drove me up the wall. But then you start doing a little bit of labor history and you recognize sometimes you need to choose your battles that you're going to fight. And them not choosing this one really set us back 40 years basically.
Yeah.
So then we get into the 1840s to 1890s, which is kind of the toleration, where capital and the government said, we recognize that unions need to exist, and they tolerated us, but they really didn't give us a whole lot of rights. They abandoned the criminal conspiracy doctrine, where the cordwainers had lost. And the pivotal case was the shoemaking industry and the Boston Journeyman Shoemaker Society. And in 1842, the Commonwealth versus Hunt, the court said that joining a union was not an illegal act. In this case, 7 members of the Boston Journeyman Bootmaker Society were tried and convicted in a lower court because we were still following the Cordwainers Act for conspiracy to join the organization that, among other things, sought to damage employers and other workers who do not join the union. The higher court rejected the decision of the lower court. They held that only when the association of individuals committed a specific illegal act would the courts entertain the question of conspiracy. So basically they said, so long as they didn't go on strike,
Yeah.
then they hadn't committed an illegal act. So it was, they won a little bit back, but not a lot. So at the time, the labor organizations were fighting hard to demand the start of public education for all children. A lot of the workers understood that education was a key to improve the quality of life for their children and for society in general. So in short, the political environment had changed from the distrust of common people to the desire to seek a greater input into society. And it kind of started aligning with more of the Jeffersonian principles or the way of thinking. But it also speaks to the fact that, the courts are once again deciding the fate of the working class people. So we move on into 1890s to the 1930s. This was moving up to the World War, where while the courts recognized that unions, that it wasn't against the law, Freedom Association wasn't against the law, what they were doing now was they were providing injunctions. So injunctions began to come on the scene of labor relations after several reversal of the criminal conspiracy doctrines. The injunction is defined as an order by a court to stop actions of one party against another party, which could result in damage to the party seeking the injunction. So basically, like I said a while ago, they said, yeah, you can join any association you want, but you can't band together and do anything about it.
Right.
So if there was a strike call, then the business would go to the court, and the court would provide an injunction. And it still happens today. When we went to, I guess we'll divert here and say, when we went to Spring Hill, Tennessee last year, what was the one thing that had happened right before we went up there was all the strikers was out there walking the picket line and blocking traffic And right before the weekend, on a Saturday, they got a judge in Tennessee to provide an injunction that said anybody that blocked traffic, I can't remember the fine, but it was like $50,000.
I thought it was 25 or 50,000.
25 or 50. Yeah, I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah.
So it kind of speaks to this is in the 1800s, and 200 years later, we're still having to deal with the same crap.
Yeah.
So the powerful employers were able to get their friendly courts, seek injunctions against workers. The employers would argue that the workers were attempting to rob his property rights, and it's just goes on and goes on, but nobody ever speaks about the employers robbing the property rights of the workers and the labor that they're providing. So the injunctions were issued under different terms, but at the end of the day, it basically went back to the businesses being in bed with the courts, and the courts blocking workers' action. The employers were able to turn the federal laws, which had been written to control the employers, against the workers. The antitrust legislation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act allowed the employers to force the federal government to issue injunctions. At the same time, the employers could demand the use of federal power to control unions. So during that same time period, unionists found that employers would force them and their fellow workers to sign an agreement where they wouldn't join the union, or what they call a yellow dog contract. So we move into 1932 to 35. The 1930s brought about a period of reform due to the excessive abuses of big business with their injunctions and things like that. And the first major legislation was the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932. And this new law attempted to right many of the abuses that the employers and the courts had instituted, basically saying you couldn't force your employers to sign a contract saying that they wouldn't join a union. It somewhat limited the use of injunctions, and it somewhat set standards for the conduct of judges. This allowed the workers to organize without fear. However, employers are forced to resort to greater violence because they lost the use of the courts to do their dirty work.
Right. The LaGuardia, one of the namesakes for the Norris-LaGuardia Act, it's just an interesting historical footnote. He was openly socialist and elected on a Republican ticket in New York.
Yeah.
So, it's just that's something that's interesting, and it's worth noting when people, like Dinesh D'Souza or, somebody else talks about the Democrats were the ones who were the party of Jim Crow or the party of the KKK or the party of, whatever.
Yeah.
That's just one more example of how radically different the parties used to be, that there were open socialists that were elected on the Republican line, in the 30s, so I thought that was interesting when I read that.
It speaks to, a lot of the things that you see a lot of the right-wing media talk about is the Republicans being the party of Lincoln. It speaks to that same type mentality, and they were the party of Lincoln, but they've lost that claim long ago.
For sure.
Not that the Democrats are a whole lot better, but they have certainly, Republicans have certainly could care less about civil rights and the rights of individuals. So yeah,
you said that they started resorting to greater violence because they lost kind of the state framework to force workers to go back to work, and
yeah,
so,
and unfortunately, that's where you see a lot of the worker deaths come in. You know, in the 1930s, when you see the Pinkertons being hired to come in and break strikes. I mean, basically, once the employers lost the strong arm of the federal government and the courts, they resorted to flat out violence, and that's where you see like the Haymarket Affair and the Pullman strike and all of these strikes that are very well known in the organized labor, mostly because they resulted in our deaths, the deaths of our forefathers. So at the same time, you had revolutions going on throughout the world, both political and social, that caused a great concern. I mean, you can go back and look at the Spanish Revolution in Spain, where the anarchists were going to overthrow the government. There was a lot of social upheaval that were centered around workers' rights. And when we say workers' rights, it's basically all of our rights, civil rights, because 90% of us are workers. So the revolutions, both political and social, caused great concern, and then the American corporations began financing the early movements of Nazism and fascism, which are the political movements of the right-wing alliances of big business and law and order nationalism, which, you know, for what it's worth, is what we see today. And a lot of people like to, a lot of the people on the right don't want to accept the fact that while they want to talk about their individual liberties as far as gun ownership goes, they don't want to recognize the individual liberties that we are losing by allowing the federal government to continue this form of oppression against workers' rights. So, yeah, big business laid the groundwork. From 1935 to 47, we have political revolution occurred in the United States. This change in America was brought about through the peaceful use of democracy, a change that allowed workers the right to organize under the genesis of present laws. The national policy of the right to organize was set to encourage the use of collective bargaining as a way to reach industrial harmony. However, employers started a campaign of propaganda which would not stop till the present day. So, kind of a caveat to say that once again, they're just, it's been an appeasement.
Yeah, during towards the end of that period is when some of the Red Scare stuff started happening, and you know, the destruction of the labor movement, like the seeds were kind of planted during this time of relative harmony.
Yeah, well, yeah, unfortunately, I guess that's when the seeds are always planted, is when you know, when everything's going good is when the other side is always plotting to figure out a way to get the upper hand. So it speaks to why we've always got to continue to be on guard. The political propaganda of the war years against unions, a slight increase in the number of strikes after the World War, and a political change brought about the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. So basically, you know, here again, we got it where it's a little bit fair, and they put several restrictions on organized labor, and it just goes back to big business is never satisfied.
One of the biggest things that was outlawed in the Taft-Hartley Act, if I'm remembering correctly, was the solidarity strike, where workers in the same kind of line of production cannot go on strike to support another set of workers who were on strike. And that was a really powerful tool that, or maybe it's called the secondary strike. Or I can't remember.
Solidarity strike is basically the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a really powerful tool that workers had in their belt. So let's say, you know, we can talk about shoemakers again. Let's say the folks maybe in the shoe store, let's say, you know, somebody at Payless Shoes, the workers there, the cashiers and the janitors and stuff at the storefront, they go on strike for better wages. In the past, oftentimes the workers in the manufacturing plant of like the sole of the shoe, they're making the rubber for the sole of the shoe, they would go on strike to support the workers in Payless. And the workers who were manufacturing and curing the leather, they would go on strike to support the workers at Payless. And that pressure on the different points of production would put more pressure on the people that own this shoe company, you know, because the manufacturers would be like, hey, you know, look, you know, Mr. Payless CEO, like, our workers are striking now too, and if you don't fix something, then we're going to have to do business with somebody else because we can't have our work. You know, you got to treat your workers right. And that was a really powerful tool that unions and workers had in the tool belt that the capitalist class just couldn't abide by. And they said, no, you can't go on strike for other workers' rights. You know, totally, just totally violating, in my opinion, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of association again. And that law still stands today. Like today, you know, if workers at Payless were striking and the workers at a rubber sole manufacturing plant went on strike to support them or vice versa, then the secondary strike, the solidarity strike, those workers would be, an injunction would be leveled against them, and they would either be made to go back to work or they would be fined or put in jail.
Yeah, I mean, they'll tell them either you go back to work or you'll lose your job. But the fact of the matter is what they've done now in today's environment, because the finances are so, unionism is such a financially intensive business because of the amount of money that you have to pour in to represent workers at the state and federal levels. What they'll do is say, okay, you look at the amount of revenue that this employer lost, and they will fine the union that amount plus the fines that are enacted by the court. So, yeah, basically they'll put any union out of business that refuses to go back to work, or not just refuses to go back to work, but that chooses to do a solidarity strike with the other workers.
Right.
So yeah, it's brutal. It is brutal what they do as far as financial wise go.
And you know, these folks that are out there ostensibly claiming to be free speech warriors that want to make sure that Nazis have the right to speak on college campuses, you know, like, where are they when workers are being fired for speaking out against injustices on the job? They're nowhere to be found because they are just weaponizing the ideals of free speech to push their political goals. They don't care about free speech. No. They don't care about a discourse. They don't care about ideas or anything like that. They have an agenda, and they're using these values that are, you know, that are widely held closely to the American public, and they're using that to push far right authoritarian ideas. They don't care about free speech. They don't care about workers. They don't care about justice or anything like that. They have a agenda that supports capitalists and the ruling class, and they are just hiding all of that behind, you know, free speech fights, and it's not real. Don't fall for it.
Yeah, it really says a lot, and I don't want to delve off too deep into that, but quickly, it really says a lot about someone's personal integrity and their personal beliefs when they say, and I'm just going to pull one out there, that somebody very racist, maybe anti-Semite, what have you, they go out and support that person to speak in San Francisco on a college campus, and they say, I don't believe in what this person is saying, but I believe they should have the right to say it. But yet they don't do the same thing for workers. That really speaks to someone's moral fortitude.
Right.
And it makes you question, do you really not believe in what they're saying? Or do you really believe in what they're saying? You just don't want to admit it.
Right. And that's exactly right. And, like I'm not saying, and I don't think you're saying that it is necessarily wrong to say like free speech for Nazis. I think that I'm probably broadly, free speech for everybody. Noam Chomsky has signed letters of support for the free speech rights of racist and authoritarian people in the past, but he's just consistently pro free speech. That is legitimately a value.
Yeah. He don't choose which one he wants to support.
Exactly. That is legitimately a value that he holds dear, and that is very important in a lot of deeply democratic socialist traditions, the value of free speech. And so, if there's actually a person out there that is that has bigoted opinions, we don't think they should be thrown in jail necessarily for having bigoted opinions, and we're not scared to say that publicly, but we are also not scared to say publicly that workers should also have freedom of speech to talk about injustices in the workplace. And I'm much more interested in that, actually. I'm not going out and trying to find Nazis that are having troubles getting a platform, and it just amazes me that there are people that fall for that ruse, that think that all these people that are constantly, I got to make sure this racist guy has a platform to talk about his racism, and they just so happen to only ever find instances of freedom of speech being violated by right-wingers or racists or Nazis. It just so happens that in the United States of America, where the ruling class is, largely white and male and hates working people, it just so happens that the only people that are ever having their free speech repressed are Nazis.
And
it's unbelievable.
And it goes back to what we talked about earlier on. And the same people that will come out and say, I don't believe in what they're doing, but I believe in their right to do it, are the same people that will say you should be firing the pro football player because he knelt at during and if you just can't have it both ways. Free speech is free speech.
That's right.
And shouldn't be any discrimination against it.
Yeah. You just watched a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We're in North Alabama talking about the news for workers by workers. We're going to be on the radio on 92.5 FM, 770 AM in the Huntsville, Decatur, Athens listening area on Saturdays from 9:30 to 11 AM beginning in May. We believe that this is a really good opportunity to put new ideas in front of a conservative talk show audience. This is an audience that has never so much as heard the word union in a positive light. But we need help raising the funds to purchase the airtime. So if you could afford to send us a few bucks, you can do that by going to patreon.com/thevalleylaborreport. If you can't afford to do that, that's fine too. There are a lot of people going through some really rough times right now. So if you could just share our videos, that would be really helpful. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.